Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Walter and I live in Toronto, Canada, where I'm a taxi driver. In our work, we do sometimes get customers that require us to drive them over long distances. I never mind jobs like that because I enjoy being out on the open road, especially when we're driving in areas of immense beauty that can be so extraordinarily breathtaking. It is times like these when I truly appreciate my job as a taxi driver. One morning I was picking up a lady from Toronto and driving her all the way to Vancouver, where she was going to stay with relatives. The lovely lady I picked up was young and well-spoken, with a beautiful crisp English accent. She told me she lived in a little village in Hampshire and had come out to Canada to visit relatives that she'd never met before. I'm going to stay with them for 3 weeks, she explained. I love Canada, she gushed. It's so beautiful here, and the countryside is just so different from England. I notice that everything here is so wide and so spread out, not like it is at home. We had a long conversation and then we both said nothing as we just absorbed the beauty of the Canadian countryside. I felt very proud to be a Canadian. As we drove past Lake Superior, which is the largest of the Great Lakes, my customer was oohing and ahhing in awe about all the beautiful views over the lake and was so intrigued when I told her that it holds 10% of the world's fresh water. We continued on our way through Saskatchewan, where we saw a lot of very large deers crossing the road. This has got to be a hunter's paradise, she reflected. Did you see the humongous antlers on that thing? They're ginormous. Well, I reflected, people do hunt here, but it is a remote part of the world, you know. I could see her through my mirror that she was nodding. I love the remoteness, she said. It makes Canada so special, places like this. I stopped in Alberta to fill with gas, and then we went merrily on our way, where the scenic route consisted of flat, long areas of open green grassland. I pointed out the ski jumps from the 1988 Olympics and drove on to the Canadian Rockies. Oh, gasped my customer, peering out of the window. Look at those mountains. They are simply magnificent. I've never seen views like this in my life. It's stunning. I pointed out Banff National Park, where she became very excited as we saw a huge bird flying over the wilderness. Did you see that wingspan? Oh my word, I believe I've just seen a real live eagle for the first time in my life. I've always wanted to see an eagle in nature, she said. Now I have. I'm so happy. I could see her sitting in the back texting her friends back home with a look of extreme excitement on her face. I knew she was telling them about the eagle she'd just seen circling in the sky. We spoke about eagles for a long time and then finally reached Revelstoke in British Columbia. I noticed that daylight was receding and it was getting darker, and that was when something quite extraordinary happened. Something that came as a huge surprise to both of us. On the side of the road I thought I could see a huge bear. My customer cried out, "Please, please, slow down, slow down. Oh, please slow down, do you mind? I've never seen a bear in the wilderness before. This is my first time to see one in the wild." "I can do better than that," I said, pulling over to the side of the road, and where the creature was standing. Only the creature was not standing. It was squatting on the ground and appeared to be eating something. It looked like he was munching a chipmunk, and he was eating it like we would eat a hot dog. It was extraordinary. "What is that?" she asked. "That's not a bear. What is it?" The creature was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Sitting down, he was about 4 foot tall, and his girth was much wider than any bear. He was covered in brown hair, but he had long arms with human-like fingers, which he was using to push the chipmunk into his mouth with great dexterity. I noticed that the way he ate reminded me of a monkey. For a moment he did not notice us sitting in the car watching him, but then again maybe he did. But he did finally look up at us, and we were both so surprised to see a human-like look on his face. Oddly enough, I did not feel any fear, and neither did my customer. We both sat there in stupefied silence, just gawking in amazement at the strange creature. The creature looked at us for a couple of seconds with large brown curious eyes. He then flung the remains of the chipmunk into some undergrowth a few yards away. We watched him rise up on long, slender, muscular legs. When he stood up, he was gargantuan, easily over 9 foot tall, and he stood erect like a man. He gave us one final glance and disappeared into the woods with 5-foot strides. "Did you see that?" gasped my customer. "What the heck was that?" "I don't know. It was far bigger than a bear." "What the heck was it?" she repeated. "It was like an animal, a monkey man. It was like nothing I've ever seen before." We sat there in silence, absorbing what we had just seen, and then I got out of the car to inspect the dead chipmunk. I showed it to my horrified customer. The creature had eaten all the innards, and I was left holding an empty skin, rather like a banana peel. When we finally made tracks and were back on the road, I glanced at the mirror at my client. I could see her tapping vigorously on her cell phone, making hundreds of texts to all her friends in England. I wished I could have been a fly on the wall and see what she was writing to her friends. So there you are. That was my Bigfoot encounter. Only I did not know that until I told my son what I had seen that day, and he had confirmed that I had seen the hairy man known as Bigfoot. Word of advice to any keen Bigfoot fans out there: do not assume every bear on the roadside is a bear. Look closer, it could indeed be a Bigfoot. If it had not been for that lovely English lady eager to see all the wildlife in Canada, I would have driven past that thing, not giving it a second thought. So there you are, that's my story, and I hope you and your listeners enjoyed it. I would really appreciate remaining anonymous, as I would not want my sanity questioned under any circumstances. But I do know what I saw that day, and it was definitely a Bigfoot. Thank you so much for that absolutely wonderful story from from Toronto in Canada. Thank you very much. Until next time, goodbye. So let's get started. I've got the most wonderful story for you, which you're absolutely going to love. It comes from Ella from Oregon, who tells us about her husband's terrifying Bigfoot encounter. So let's get started. I think you're really going to enjoy the story. Dear Sarah, I'm writing to tell you about my husband's terrifying experience when he encountered a pair of Bigfoots. It happened in the fall of 2011 in the woods a few miles from our home in Oregon. When my husband was a young boy, he would go squirrel hunting with his father, and he enjoyed it so much that when he was older, he graduated to deer hunting. He even made his own deer stand out of the strongest steel materials and found the perfect position in the woods to erect it, where he believed he would get the best opportunity to shoot a deer. My husband was using a very powerful rifle for shooting, and every spare moment he had, he would go shooting in the woods. I'd never seen anyone more passionate about the sport than he was. He told me that shooting helped him feel a sense of escapism from the stresses of life. It was on a Saturday morning that he decided to go shooting into the woods. He told me that when he arrived, the woods felt very menacing and creepy. There were no birds tweeting in the woods, and no sign of any animal life of any kind. He said that he noticed a flattened area of grass, just covered with hundreds of turkey feathers, as well as loads of carcasses of deer and coyote. He was alarmed to see so many animal bones strewn all over the place. It really gave him an uneasy feeling. He also noticed some thick black hair coiled on a snap branch, and he studied it closely, but could not identify what animal it came from. He sat on his deer stand, but there were no signs of any animal life. It was then that he heard the rustle of a huge oak tree and saw a humongous figure climbing down the tree with the agility of a orangutan monkey, which was odd because this thing sliding down the tree looked like a 700-pound bear, only it wasn't a bear. The creature did not have paws like a bear, but very large humanoid-looking hands. He was holding a bird nest in his hands and cracking open the eggs it contained with his mouth. He was sliding the yolks down his throat and then spitting the shells onto the ground. As he stood up, he was 7 foot tall, with a huge chest, massive arms that were very long, extending beyond his knees, and his feet were humongous. My husband noticed that his hair was thick and black and very matted with mud. He said it looked like he had dreadlocks. Apparently the face was longish and cone-shaped, but it also had a human look about it. It appears as if he had little or no neck, and huge shoulders tapering down to a slim flashboard belly and strong muscular legs. When he moved, he had an ape-like stance with a bounce to his legs. As he turned around, my husband saw the brown eyes and even the whites in the eyes, but he said the creature looked so menacing and so evil. His eyes were filled with intense hatred and fury. He started to growl furiously at my husband, exposing his hideous-looking teeth. My husband was so terrified and told me that he just froze, and it was so hard to move because his legs felt like lead. The creature let out the most terrible roar, equal to that of a lion, but with a more menacing undertone. He declared that he would rather have faced a lion head-on than this creature. He said the fear was beyond words, because no word in the dictionary could express the magnitude of his intense anxiety. He said that he was too scared to use his gun in case the creature got madder, and he felt sure that his high-powered rifle was no match for this creature. Suddenly there was a huge whistle in the distance, and then the creature responded with the same kind of sound. He realized now he would be facing 2 Bigfoots, and he knew suddenly that he was in graver danger and his life was in deep peril. The whistle sound those creatures made sounded like bird song. My husband said he had heard that sound so many times before in the woods. My husband fired a couple of shots in the air and ran backwards towards his car because he needed to keep watching the creatures in case they ambushed him. He could hear now that 2 creatures were chasing him through the wooded thicket, running through the barricades of thorns and brambles as if they were nothing. While by contrast my husband was running down the clear open dirt road towards his car. He said that he dived onto the driver's seat and with trembling hands he turned the engine on and sped away as fast as he could, looking back in terror through his window at 2 Bigfoots who were shaking their arms defiantly in the air in a gesture of huge amount of anger and fury. When he came home, I'd never seen my husband look so white, and he sat there and just said nothing for a long while. When I put my arms around him, I could feel he was trembling. I'd never seen him so shaken up before, and even today he is still experiencing post-traumatic stress from the incident. We did go back to his deer stand a couple of days later, and all those tough metal posts were completely ripped out, and his deer stand was completely destroyed. Now you'd have had to have superhuman strength to move them. We both felt that it was a clear message from the Bigfoots to stay away. Looking back, I do think that if the Bigfoots wanted to kill him, they would have, and I wondered if they were charging him to scare him away from their territory. My husband does not agree and believes it was their intention to kill him. My husband is not as carefree as he used to be, and he has never hunted since the event, which is very, very sad. Hope you found his story of interest, Ella. Thank you, Ella, so much for your lovely Bigfoot encounter. Not that it was a happy one by any means, but thank you. Dear Sarah, I am writing to you about my Bigfoot experience. My name is Jane, and I'm from the southern part of Hublot County in California, near to the Pacific Ocean. In this part of the world, you just need to drive down the highway and you see a lot of Bigfoot posters and even Bigfoot statues made of carved trees. So yes, Bigfoot has been on my mind for a long time, because there are reminders of him everywhere. I have watched all the programs of Bigfoot, and I just was so eager to have a sighting. So every year, 3 of my friends and I would go to Redwood National State Park. I felt that it was a likely spot to see a Bigfoot, but in so many ways, with the man-made paths and wooden seating, I wondered if Bigfoots would keep away from all those tourist areas where people go hiking all the time. I mean, if I was a Bigfoot, I would keep away from all the visitor trails. I did love going to the park because of those ginormous redwood trees, some so beautiful and old that they have huge trunks with moss growing all over them. However, every year, over and over again, we had absolutely no sightings of a Bigfoot, and there were no visible signs of Bigfoot activity, such as snapped tree limbs or large footprints in the muddy areas. We always went to the park after it had rained, but we never went squatching at night, which may be one of the reasons why it was so hard to have a Bigfoot sighting. One day I was shopping in California and I went into one of those mystical shops where they sell all those curious things like dream catchers, essential oils, tarot cards, incense sticks, crystal pendulums, bundles of dried sage, and the list goes on. I decided to buy some essential oils and I chose helicrispin, lavender and sandalwood. The lady who served me was very friendly, and when I purchased my stuff she gave me a little wooden carved Bigfoot as a free gift. I then told her my story about how hard I'd been trying to search for the elusive hairy man with the oversized feet. Maybe he doesn't want to be found, she said. Then she said, but you could find him with the right energy. What do you mean, I asked. Well, write him a letter telling him how much you want to meet him, or one of his kind, and then burn it and throw the ashes in your garden. You'll be sending out energy, vibration and frequency. She proceeded to tell me that everything in the universe was made of energy, and that even Tesla had said that the secret to the universe was energy, frequency, and vibration. You need your vibration to match Bigfoot's, and that's when you'll see him, she said. Will it work? I asked. Only if you have faith, she said, and only if the creature does decide to show himself to you. I thought it was very weird, and I told my friends, and they said that people working in those mystical shops are gaga, and the lady was clearly off her head. However, the little voice in my head said, do it anyway. What have you got to lose? If you're like me and want something badly enough, you'll do it anyway, no matter how extreme or wacky it sounds. So one day I wrote Bigfoot a letter, and it read, Dear Bigfoot, beings, whoever you are, I'm longing to meet one of your kind, just to know that you are real, as I believe you are. Much love, Jane. I then burnt the letter and threw the ashes in my garden. After performing the ritual, I did feel really foolish, like a little kid sending a plea to Father Christmas in the North Pole. But what the heck, I thought. At least I've given it a shot. It was in 2018 that we returned to Redwood National Park. It was a very wet day and the forest was very misty. It kind of gave the whole place a mystical ambience, I thought. We finally found ourselves on the Ladybird Johnson Trail, and that was the place where I had my Bigfoot encounter. I told my friends I needed to pee, and I have to go now. I normally had a great bladder control, and it was unlike me to be desperate for the loo, but I was holding my legs so tightly, which was weird because I had not drunk enough to justify a full bladder. Go, said my friends, but be quick, you do not want anyone to see you. I trotted off the large path into the undergrowth towards one of those oversized redwood trees covered with moss and with a massive girth to hide behind so that no one could see me, and then I started to pee. I looked up towards my left because I felt I was being watched, and I saw him, and I knew at once who he was. It was a Bigfoot. He stood there like a statue, and I was so shocked. I just gawped at him with my mouth hanging open as if I was seeing a ghost. You see, even though I'd longed to meet this elusive being, now that he was standing before me, I was in such shock, although surprisingly enough I did not feel any fear. He was tall, but not that tall, about 6 foot, and he had brown hair covering his whole body like a bear, apart from his face and hands. His face was longish and human-like, but his mouth, eyes and nose were different to ours. His nose was flat and his mouth was thin. He had brown eyes, and I could see the whites of his eyes as well. His arms were very long, and he had human-like hands, and his chest was broad, and his legs lean and lanky. He just looked at me for a moment, and our eyes locked in a brief stare. He then turned around, and with a huge 5-foot stride, he vanished into the woods, almost like a ghost. It was that quick. I rubbed my eyes in disbelief. Was this for real, I thought, or was I imagining things? But I knew I had seen him, and it was just such a magical moment. I felt as if I'd made some weird kind of connection with the mythical creature that many doubt even exist. I thought back to the lady in the mystical shop and wondered if it was a coincidence that I had encountered Bigfoot, or was there more to this energy thing that I had ever considered? Was it a coincidence that a letter to Bigfoot had somehow led to encounter, or was it just sheer chance? I rushed out of the tree line to tell my friends what I'd seen, and I could see by their expressions they thought I was making it all up. But my friend Annika doubted that I was telling porkies, because she said she had never ever caught me in a lie before. When I returned home that night, I performed another crazy ritual. I wrote a letter saying, "Dear Bigfoot, thank you for showing me that you exist. I do hope to see you again one day. Thank you for the encounter. Love, Jane." And then I burnt it and threw the ashes away in my garden. I do not expect you or your listeners to believe my Bigfoot account, because it sounds so wacky and way out. And if I was in your shoes, I would not believe it either. But I do know what I saw that day, and it was a Bigfoot, and so there you are, believe it or not. Either way, it's up to you, but I just thought I'd tell you my story. Thank you so much, Jane. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, I'm writing to tell you about the encounter that my grandfather, called James, and his brother Jackson had with Bigfoots during the Vietnam War. These two accounts are both extremely different, but also very fascinating. I thought you would be interested to hear their accounts. My grandfather told me that his brother Jackson was drafted into the Vietnam War at age 18 in 1969 and had an experience with a creature the people of Vietnam called Moi, which means wild men. The locals had reported sightings of these creatures as far back as 1822. Jackson was enrolled with Company D, 1st Battalion 507 Infantry Regiment. One day, he was sitting on the ridge 10 miles from Way City with his army mates, and they were just talking about a friend who had been bitten by a poisonous snake and had died only hours earlier. It was a sad reality that snake bites, especially poisonous ones, were not uncommon at the base. It was a given, my grandfather said, that people did not just die from the ravages of war, if that wasn't bad enough already. He had army mates, he told me, that were killed by tigers, and also 2 friends who died of heat stroke, and 3 who died from serious falls. He said the terrain in Vietnam, especially in the mountainous regions, was rugged and treacherous, and they had to work their way through heavy, dense undergrowth using machetes. They were literally going into areas of Vietnam jungle that few had ever ventured, so it was exceedingly dangerous, especially the unknown factor, which can be a hazardous aspect to any expedition. Going back to the story, his brother Jackson was eating a plate of chicken stroganoff and rice when suddenly they smelt a really nasty odor that they described as smelling like decaying flesh and wet dog blended together in a hideous fragrance. Jackson said the smell was so odiously rank that 2 of the men just threw up violently and could not finish their food. Then he said they suddenly heard the sound of branches being snapped, and they thought they saw the silhouettes of about 8 North Vietnamese soldiers. It was a dreadful case of misidentification. In a panic, they literally fired several rounds with their M16 rifles, and then they heard the most thunderous roar that was unlike anything that they had ever heard in their entire lives. He said it really scared them half to death, and the couple of soldiers were so afraid they were literally shaking in terror, and one was so terrified he shat his pants. Apparently they believed that a roar of a tiger would have been more welcome than that unfamiliar sound. It was then that the creatures made their presence known, and all 8 of them were growling at the soldiers very aggressively. But the most intimidating was the alpha male, who was terrifying in his demeanor and was extremely protective towards the other creatures. The creatures were about 6 foot tall in height. They had thick brown reddish hair all over their bodies, and they even had long tails. They stood on 2 legs, but there was no doubt, according to the men, that these creatures would have been equally comfortable running on all fours. They had long arms that went well below their knees, and they had human-like hands. The faces were long, the ears covered in hair, and the eyes were deep brown, lips thin, and noses flat. The bodies were lean, slender, athletic, and agile, and the chests were indeed large, at 3 feet across in circumference. The big alpha male was very big in comparison to the 6-footers, because he stood at a huge 8 feet tall and about 700 pounds in weight. But he was furious. The fury was very aggressive and tangible to the soldiers, and they definitely felt fear, despite being so superbly armed. The alpha male did a mock charge towards them, although at the time it seemed like a genuine charge. He then ran backwards into the brush, never keeping his eyes off the men. Within seconds, all 8 of them just vanished in 5-foot backward strides and tore into the deep, dense jungle full of thorn needles as if it was nothing. Jackson said the post-traumatic stress the troops experienced was worse than from the ravages of war, and he described what he saw was definitely a creature not known by science, but definitely a mannish kind of monkey that he believed to be a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. My grandfather's encounter, on the other hand, was totally different, possibly because his encounter did not happen with any aggression whatsoever. In fact, my grandfather describes his sightings of these Vietnamese Sasquatch as one of the most joyous experiences he ever had during the war in Vietnam, or even his whole life. My grandfather's experience happened a year before his brother's, in the year 1968. He was 19 years old at the time and had volunteered to join the army. He was at Company M3, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine. One day my grandfather was taking some exercise on the top of a rocky ridge where he was doing press-ups. He said the men did everything they could to maintain their fitness levels, because when you're dealing with life and death situations on a daily basis, you need to be in the best possible physical shape, he told me. He said that as he was doing press-ups, he saw this bipedal creature resembling a man, but it was not a man. It definitely had a primate look to it and was red and brown in color. 6 foot tall, much like the creatures that Jackson had described a year later. This creature was not afraid of my grandfather, not one little bit, and my grandfather was not afraid of it, because its demeanor was gentle and sweet. My grandfather got the impression that this creature was a juvenile, and he guessed it was male, but he could not tell because the hair covering on this creature hid any revealing genitalia. The creature literally made the cutest sound and then copied my grandfather's workout because he thought it was some kind of funny and wonderful game. The problem was, my grandfather said, that the creature was so agile, athletic, and efficient at any kind of physical activity that he definitely made my grandfather feel woefully inadequate by comparison, like a sack of potatoes, he said. I remember one day the creature watched me scratch myself senseless. I was itching all over, my grandfather told me. I gather 2 of the biggest bummers in the Vietnam War was that men hated were the swarming insects and intense humidity. Anyway, the creature gave my grandfather leaves that smelt a lot like lemon balm. Well, when they rubbed the leaves on all the bites, the itching went away and the insects did not attack him again. The creature made all the men laugh because he would mimic everything they did in such a comical way that it was impossible not to smile. The creature followed them around for several days and was always chattering excitedly. He played peekaboo with them the whole time and would watch the men's daily routines with curious intensity. They would give him bananas and fruit, which he enjoyed, but one day they gave him a chocolate bar, and he was so excited when he tasted it. I think he just loved it, my grandfather reflected. There was one occasion that a soldier had been flung into the air by a booby trap because he had failed to keep on the path and had wandered off. Fortunately, he did not lose his life. However, his leg was blown off and left dangling from a tree. The guy received urgent medical attention, and the creature went up and retrieved his leg and presented it to me. The leg was way too damaged to be reattached. I gave the creature a big chocolate bar for that, he told me, laughing at the recall. Anyway, one day we saw the creature go off with two other red creatures, clearly older than he was. I think they may have been Sasquatch elders coming to drag him away from us back into the jungle. They did give us a fleeting, curious glance, and they all went off together. After the creature left, morale sank to an all-time low because everyone missed the creature and his comical ways, and he had spread so much joy among the men. When my grandfather returned to North America, he always talked about the Bigfoot he encountered, and he called the creature Samoy. The Sa was short for Sam, and the Moy was the Vietnamese name for hairy man. He did say that their incredible story fell on deaf ears, although there was a report about it in some journal, but no one believed them and thought it was a tall story. But my grandfather knows what he saw, and it definitely was the Vietnamese Bigfoot. Some people even suggested that he could have met up with orangutan monkeys, which is ridiculous, and furthermore, orangutans cannot be found in Vietnam, but they do have primates there, like the white gibbon. So there you are. That is my grandfather's account of the hairy man. Apparently there were several sightings of Bigfoots with the American soldiers during the war in Vietnam. You see, the soldiers were venturing into thick jungle, misty ridges and ravines, places few humans have ventured before. Even one of the mountains was called subsequently Monkey Mountain after several curious sightings of what some people have called rock apes over the years. There were also stories about rock throwing from these creatures at some of the soldiers, which is why they were called rock apes in the first place. A true account or not, you decide. But this is what my grandfather's account was, and I, for one, emphatically believe him. Love to you and all your listeners. Thank you so much for a phenomenal account from all the way from Vietnam. Do you believe it really happened? Interesting. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, I have not told many people the story because when it happened to me in the early 1970s, most people had never heard of Bigfoot before. I was 11 years old in the spring of 1972 when my parents decided to take a day's excursion to the National Forest somewhere in Virginia. I really do not remember the specific location of my encounter, but I do remember the day that I was abducted by a Bigfoot with vivid clarity. My parents decided it would be nice to go for a picnic, as my mother's sister, Monique, was staying with us for a few days. She lived in Houston in Texas. My mother liked to always show her a good time when she came to stay with us in Virginia. Monique was married with 2 children, James, who was 10, and Jesse, who was 12. Even though Monique's children were boys, they never treated me like a girl because they always included me in their games, and so I liked them for that. So it was on a beautiful Sunday morning that all 7 of us found ourselves walking in the National Forest. And as children, we had heaps of fun. We played I Spy and we chased each other in the woods until we were thoroughly exhausted. My father had set up a day camp and had made a fire in the woods where we barbecued some delicious spatchcock chickens on an open grill, which we served with salad, cornbread and potato salad. While my parents chatted away happily, the boys and I decided to play hide and seek. Jesse started to count, while James and I scattered away quickly, trying to locate the perfect spot to hide. It's easy hiding in the woods because of the ubiquitous trees everywhere. I found the most perfect tree to hide behind, with a very large girth, covered with lots of moss and with hollow indentations in the bark. and on one side there was a large cleavage where I could squeeze my body into that hollow without being seen. I was very pleased because I felt convinced that Jessie would never be able to find me. "Come in whether you're ready or not," came Jessie's voice. I stood very still because I could hear the crunching of the forest litter under heavy feet. Has Jessie already guessed where I'm hiding, I wondered, feeling the inevitable disappointment rising in my heart. What a bummer, just when I had thought that I'd found the most perfect hiding spot in the whole forest. Jessie was a light person with a very slight build, but on this day he sounded like an elephant on the forest floor. I thought he was making these heavy stomping sounds just to scare us. It's not working, I thought. At that moment it seemed like Jessie had stopped at the tree where I was hiding, and I could feel his eyes on me. My heart was pounding, and I closed my eyes tightly, hoping that if I stayed deadly still, he might not notice me squirreled away in the hollow of the tree corner. I heard a couple of heavy breaths, and I grinned to myself silently. Jessie was really using scare tactics to flush us out of our hiding places, I thought. At that moment, strong arms seized hold of my body and whirled me onto the top of a pair of large shoulders. I was hanging at about 8 feet off the ground and surrounded by a sea of 2-inch long sandy brown muddy hair that was matted and stunk horribly. It reminded me of a toy teddy bear I owned once and refused to have washed. Eventually my mother threw the thing away because its fur had become horribly bedraggled and our dog had peed over it a couple of times. The hair on this thing was just like that, but much smellier, a very acetone, like urine kind of smell. I was in shock, and no, I did not scream, not at first. I felt so shocked by what was happening to me that I really believed I was dreaming and was about to wake up from a horrible nightmare. That's how surreal it all felt. The creature that was carrying me was enormous, and he literally glided as he walked. I did not feel that bumpiness you get on horseback. He carried me with such fluidity it was extraordinary, and I could tell that in his arms I was lighter than a feather. As he carried me, I got a good view of his feet, and they were enormous. I really believed I was in the arms of a giant, hairy monster, a creature that had hairy, human-like feet and legs, feet and hands. I do remember calling out, "Help!" but my voice did not come out in a scream. I just remember gentle cries coming out, "Mum, Dad, please help!" But I couldn't scream. Tears just poured down my face. I honestly do not know what I felt at that moment. I was so numb with the shock that the immense fear robbed my body of any real emotion and any desire to fight back. The creature moved so fast that in seconds I knew that the picnic spot where my parents were chatting was long since left behind us. The creature appeared to be walking uphill, and all this time he made no sounds. Eventually we came to a clearing where the creature removed some mossy covering on the forest floor, which covered a hole in the ground. The creature literally jumped into the hollow with me on his back and landed so smoothly, like a cat jumping from a kitchen surface to the floor. Inside the hole was this large underground tunnel that looked like those underground air raid shelters from World War II. It was so cleverly hidden. I doubt a human being would ever be able to notice it. I was surprised to find it was not too dark in the tunnel, as streams of sunlight filtered into the whole area. I noticed there was a couple of smooth, large boulders on the ground that looked like makeshift chairs, and there was a large corner of the tunnel filled with grasses and twigs that looked like a nesting area. I assumed that that was where the creature slept. On a broken tree branch held up against the wall of the tunnel was a half-eaten carcass of an elk. The creature put me down so that my bottom landed with perfect precision on one of the smooth rocks, and then he studied me as if he was seeing me for the very first time. I just stood there gawking at him, hardly daring to believe at what I was looking at. What on earth is this creature, I wondered. His eyes looked curious but also pleased. Well, that was the impression I got, as if he had brought back a big trophy to admire. I did not get the impression I was on the dinner menu because he threw me a piece of meat from the elk and looked surprised when I just left it there on the muddy floor. His actions gave me some hope because I had never heard of a hunter feeding an animal before he ate it, so I knew that I would have to think of a way to finally escape. At that moment I heard a loud thump, and then there was another big creature standing in front of me, and I could see that she was female because of her breasts. I could tell she was not happy to see me. She suddenly started to chatter angrily at the male, and he would chatter back, and then she would chatter and he would chatter, and this went on for an age. I got a really good look at the creatures while they appeared to be arguing over me, as every time they were chattering away, she would glance at me with very disapproving eyes. I knew she did not want me in this little abode, and by the looks of things she really did call all the shots, because the male finally started hanging his head in shame like a schoolboy who had been reprimanded. The bodies of these creatures were covered in hair, much like a bear, and it was everywhere except on their faces. It was matted all over it with mud, and there were sharp needles, burrs, and pieces of shrubbery caught up in their hair, and it was a tangled mess. Their heads were cone-shaped, and their faces long and human-like, although the grey skin texture was tough like a rhino hide. The eyes were dark brown, the nose was flat, and the mouths were thin. The creatures had teeth like ours, only much bigger. The female stood up at about 8 foot tall, so she was much smaller than the 10-foot male, but both of them were very stocky and muscular, especially around the chest, shoulders, and upper arms. The legs were long and lanky, and the feet enormous. I watched the female scold the male. She even lunged towards him a few times and growled in a warning tone, "Ha! Ha!" Then suddenly, before I could even say Jack Robinson, the male scurried away like a naughty schoolboy, with my body slung over his shoulders like a sack of potatoes. This time the creature chose to run, and I found myself going through the forest at lightning speed, and it's once again, the run was far more fluid than a horse trot. It literally felt like we were gliding along the forest floor. As he ran, there were no boundaries, there were no barricades, because he tore through the undergrowth, clearly oblivious of the sharp thorns that tore my skin to shreds in places. Finally, I could hear my mother's voice laughing, and I realized the creature was bringing me back to my parents, and I was so relieved. He dropped me on the ground, and I ran to my mother, howling and crying like a baby. "What on earth is the matter?" my mother asked. "I thought you were playing hide and seek. Jessie's been looking for you everywhere." I tried to explain that a humanoid ape-like creature had abducted me and taken me to his lair. Well, imagine my mother and aunt. They just hooted with laughter. They thought I was hilariously funny. My mother affectionately tossed my hair. "You mark my words," she said to Aunt Monique. "We have the makings of a fine comedian here." As you can imagine, I was gutted that my story fell on deaf ears, because no one believed me, not even for a minute. My mother was cross with me for getting so cut up by the needles and the undergrowth, and she scolded me for being so reckless. As for my cousins, Jessie was unhappy about me taking so long to give up my hiding place, and I could tell he had a big case of the sulks, so I just ignored him. I realized that my abduction ordeal only lasted for minutes, but that moment in time seemed to last forever, because everything seemed to go into such slow motion. All these years later, I have never told my story until now, because I knew it would be impossible to believe. I won't be in the slightest bit bothered if your listeners do not believe me, because I know it really happened. For obvious reasons, I would like to remain anonymous. Thank you so much for that lovely story. Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it. because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.